So this presentation is sociological institutions, and this focuses on the economy and work, but specifically economics. So we'll talk about what is the goal of the economic system. We'll discuss capitalism. We'll talk about what is the socialist theory of economics, which is socialism, and what is the communist theory of economics, which is communism. So when we talk about the economy fulfills the basic social function of the production and distribution of goods and services. So let's briefly look at what actually is a good and what is a service when we're talking about the economy. Now, goods are commodities that are things that are necessary to live. You might think of food, clothing, shelter, milk, furniture, a bed, toothpaste, your makeup, your hair, whatever it is that you need to live. And then services are things that benefit others. So medical care, car repair, teaching, haircuts, these are services. So these are things that we do or perform. So goods are tangible items. Services are activities that we perform for others. So even like being a bartender or a waitress, that's a service. That would be a service. Now, one of the things that a lot of people don't really consider is that how our economic system is structured is that political ideology plays a big part in the production, distribution, and the consumption of goods and services. And so what we're going to talk about are the characteristics of the three major economic systems. That's capitalism, socialism, and communism. This is a great chart because it has contemporary examples and characteristics in a small chart. So within capitalism and a capitalistic economy, one of the biggest things from a pre-industrial or an agricultural standpoint is that land was so important. Land was the source of wealth. Land and land ownership allowed you to be considered wealthy. Now, once we move from an agrarian to an industrial society, this meant that we had to kind of shift how we considered what was wealth. So, changing into an industrial revolution, changing into an industrial society meant that individuals and institutions had to be willing to finance new inventions. They had to finance business enterprises. And so then we have this huge shift from land ownership as wealth to people holding large sums of money as a powerful economic force. And so this was then moved from agriculture to private ownership of business, which then meant that we're no longer even like, say, on a bartering system. Hey, I've got 4 cows. I need 2 horses. Let me trade you one of my cows for 2 horses or something like that. So we're moving from a bartering system to a capitalist economic system. Now, I do want to say there is often considered a possible movement toward a post-industrial, and so we've moved from agricultural to industrial, and what is a post-industrial? So a post-industrial is where we start increasing our valuation of knowledge. So it's not just what can you do, it's what can you create, what can you what do you know, and so this means that we'll have a growing role of universities and research institute. And this is kind of how we see our movement within post-industrial is to a knowledge-based system, but also where we start moving out of a industrial manufacturing position and into more of a service oriented. So this also comes within like your knowledge and your technology knowledge. So I like what Tarr says, which is knowledge is power and technology is the instrument. So we're really kind of moving in this direction. We've been moving in this direction, but limited education is another is problematic toward a movement to post-industrialization. So let's talk about capitalism. And capitalism is a economic system in which the means of production are largely held in private hands, that's privately owned, and the main incentive of capitalism, the main incentive for economic activity is the accumulation of profits, either for the owner or for the stock or shareholder. Now, what this does, and there is another video on means of production that I kind of go a little bit more into that, but if we're talking about the means of production, we're talking about all the physical elements that go into producing our goods and services. So our natural resources, our machines, our tool, our offices, our computers, our means of distribution. So do we sell it via the internet? Do we sell it in stores? How do we get it there? Our transportation. All of this is privately owned. Now, in reality, there's a lot of things that we appreciate about capitalism, and there's some things that we find worrisome and bothersome on capitalism. So let's move forward and see where we're going with capitalism on this. Well, our capitalist system, so in reality, our capitalist systems vary in the degree to which the government regulates private ownership and economic activity. And so, one of the things that we can look at is what is a laissez-faire. And so laissez-faire basically means let them do. Adam Smith came up with this construct. It's very different than what we have now. A laissez-faire situation, the principle of laissez-faire, as Adam Smith really wrote about this, is that businesses could freely compete. There's a very limited government intervention, and the businesses are regulating themselves, and so what they're doing is they're policing themselves, and they are operating without fear of government interference or intervention. Well, today's form of capitalism does not have the laissez-faire aspect of capitalism. So we actually have more policing with contemporary capitalism. So in contemporary capitalism, one of the biggest aspects of it is that we have regulations. We have government regulations in place so that businesses cannot, number one, mislead the consumer. So I cannot, as a business owner, tell you that my product is, this is, now listen, this is very important. I cannot mislead you as a consumer. So Cheerios, used to say that eating Cheerios could help you lower your cholesterol. Well, yeah, that was misleading to consumers. And so the FDA said, hey, listen, we haven't done a study on this. You have to stop. You cannot mislead the consumers. And so if you go look at Cheerios now, it does not say anything about lowering your cholesterol. Also, regulations are in place so that businesses are not endangering their workers. Now, this also, we have regulations. So when you look at OSHA, Occupational Safety and Hazards, one of the aspects of that is, listen, if I am moving crates in a warehouse, I have to wear a hard hat, I have to wear boots, steel-toed boots, I have to have training on the equipment that we're using, and so we can't endanger our workers. And also, you know that this is big because people would get injured and then they no longer could work. And so, we have these safety regulations in place. Well, also we can't defraud our investors, and that means that if we are a publicly traded company and we have investors, or even if we are a privately held company and we have investors, we have a responsibility to our investors, our stockholders, and our share holders to offer transparency, and we cannot defraud them. So I think that this is some of the stuff that you saw back. If you ever watch American Greed, you'll see some of this. Enron was one of the ones that really kind of got hammered in the news media on this. So let's also say that, while we have regulations, it is very, very rare for the government to take over ownership of an entire industry. That is very rare. However, there are some exceptions. So contemporary capitalism, it also tolerates monopolistic practices, and a monopoly is, so that, listen very carefully, a monopoly exists when a single business firm controls the market. Okay, a single business firm controls the market. So let's just say we're having cable or internet, and so I move into my apartment or my trailer or my house or wherever, and I get there and I can only use Comcast, or I can only use Time Warner, or I can only use Mediacom. And particularly in neighborhoods and in apartment complexes, a lot of times they have like a monopoly on this. And so if I'm living in an apartment and the apartment has only an agreement with Time Warner, I cannot have Comcast. I cannot have Mediacom. I can't have AT&T. I can only have Time Warner. And so, this is problematic. What this does is it says, well, hey, if you want cable, you can only get it from me. And, all you can do is basically buy it from there, because there's no other place to purchase this service or the product. Now, monopolistic practices actually violate the ideal of free market competition, which is part of what Adam Smith and other supporters of laissez-faire capitalism discuss. And so, it's wrong. This is not, from an economic standpoint, what we should be doing, because free market dictates that if I prefer Comcast to Time Warner, I should be able to get Comcast instead of Time Warner. I shouldn't be just holding to one. You also see this with utilities. Many of you live in the state of Georgia. Let's just say that most of us have Georgia Power. If we live in Alabama, we have Alabama Power. If we live in Florida, we have Florida Power. I lived in North Carolina and I had Duke Energy, all part of the Southern Company. So there were no other options to get my electricity. That was the only place that I could get my electricity from. So this is what we're talking about when we are talking about monopolistic practices. So, if we're looking at what we sometimes do from a severe economic downturn. This is, we had bailouts in 2008. This was 11 years ago. Those of us that were selling homes, going into grad school, all these different things were pretty flipped out over bailouts. 2008, the banks were given a lot of money as a bailout. The U.S. moved further away during this time frame from the laissez-faire John Smith ideal. And so to keep these financial institutions from going under, the federal government, you as taxpayers, me as a taxpayer, we invested hundreds of billions of dollars in our distress banking, investment, and insurance companies. So here was our rescue plan. The government was going to buy up to 250 billion. I can't even say the number, it's so high. 250 billion in stock, and half of it at large banks. Now, this was a key thing. Executive compensation was limited at the banks that received these investments. And we also, remember, that we as society provided FDIC insurance to all non-interest bearing accounts. And non-interest bearing accounts are usually used by businesses. Okay? So here are the largest banks and how much money in billions that they received. So if you look, Bank of America, Citigroup, JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, all received over $10 billion in bailouts. Now, in 2009, the government, us, taxpayers, bailed out the automobile industry. And actually in GM, the government bought, U.S. taxpayers bought 60% interest in General Motors. And then we, U.S. taxpayers who bought 60% interest, lost, okay, let's see the numbers. We lost $11.2 billion as a result of the bailout. Now, we, U.S. taxpayers, spent $49.5 billion to bail out GM. And when our Treasury, the U.S. Treasury, sold off the stock, we lost $11.2 billion. Now, here's the thing. The Center for Automotive Research said that the taxpayer bailout of GM saved 1.2 million jobs and avoided a loss of 129.2 billion in personal income. And over all of the automobile industry, the U.S. taxpayers spent $78.2 billion in bailing out the auto industry, and only $58 billion was repaid. So $20 billion was not repaid. In fact, it was a write-off. We had a whole bunch of write-offs. So, this is socialism. Guys, this is socialism. This does not happen in capitalistic markets. In capitalistic markets, we would allow General Motors to fail. So let me clarify this in saying that this is socialistic in nature. Taxpayers bought 60% of GM with our taxpayer contributions, right? And I don't know about you, but I didn't see any stock money. So I'm still waiting. This is what we mean by socialism. And so when we talk about the United States being, capitalism, it's a capitalism marketplace. No. We have a capitalistic market, an economy. However, let me also say that there is lots of socialism within the United States. And this is actually clearly one of the instances of socialism. So a privately held company benefited from a bailout from a socialistic standpoint. And I just want to make that clear because sometimes we think that's really not us that did that, but it is. All right. Now let's move to socialist theory. So Marx and Engels, so Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, were in the early 19th century very, very disturbed, mid to early 19th century, very disturbed by the working class exploitation, which began during the Industrial Revolution. And so what they wrote in Communist Manifesto came to be known as the Socialist Marxism and the Socialist Theory. And then we'll see how communism fits in a few minutes. So within socialism, one of the biggest components of this, unlike capitalism, is that in socialism, we the people, we society are the collective owners of the means of production and distribution. So it's not a private enterprise, it's collectively owned. And our basic objective or goal is not to make a profit. It is to meet people's needs rather than maximizing a profit. And this also, the ability to meet people's needs without looking at a maximizing of a profit, actually eliminates economic exploitation. So the way that that this works, this is also a rejection of laissez-faire philosophy. So as socialists, we are rejecting the laissez-faire philosophy and free market capitalism. Okay. Now, what socialist economic systems do is the government owns all of the major industries, and the central government acts on behalf of the people, and they make the basic economic decisions. And with a government ownership of all of the major industries. So let's think about this. Steel production, automobile manufacturing, agriculture, all of these are owned by the central government. Now, let me put this out, because this is kind of really, interesting, right? I mean, because we hear all the time about how the U.S. capitalists, we're capitalists, we're capitalists. In this concept of social economic systems, all of the social and capitalistic economies, a lot of this stuff is very, very meshed together. So, socialist economic systems may vary to the extent of which they tolerate any private ownership. And a great example of this is Great Britain. So Great Britain has aspects of both the socialist and capitalist economy. Previously, the airline was owned by Britain. It was owned by the government. It was called British Airways. It was privatized in 1987. But we did have private airlines that were allowed to compete with it. And we also should say that within socialism, a lot of times healthcare is a socialist benefit. We'll talk about that also in a second. So this always shocks people when I say that, we have socialism within the United States. And I don't really understand why people don't get this. Let's look at socialism within the United States. Now, some of these programs are means tested, which means that we determine whether you are eligible. So, we might look at Pell Grant money if you meet certain income levels. Or do you have Medicaid if you meet certain income levels? Do you have food stamps or free or reduced lunch if you meet certain income levels? So, but for the most part, all of this stuff is paid for collectively by the taxpayers with our taxes. And this is socialism, guys. I mean, it all goes into a pot and it is paid for. Now, let's look at it. So, do you have grandparents who are on Medicare? Every single one of us who work, pay into Medicare and Social Security. Now, if you've taken social gerontology or you've taken aging policy with me, then you know a lot more about Medicare and Social Security than probably Medicare and Social Security recipients at this point. Because, this is what we look at and we call these things pay-go systems. And that means those of us who are currently working are paying in to the system so other people can have Medicare, which is Medicare is for people who are disabled or people who are qualified based on their age and a either specific number of credits of where they have worked or that their spouse has worked. And if you took policy, you've seen all of this. And so let's also talk about public education, K through 12 and the universities. All of this comes from tax money, guys. Where does tax money come from? Tax money comes from the citizenry. We pay taxes. Okay? We pay taxes. Actually, as a homeowner or someone who is renting an apartment, oh, trust me, you are paying part of your taxes toward a public education system. The K-12 and the university system. Fire and police departments. When you live in a city and you call the fire department or the police department, you expect them to show up. What you do not expect is them to give you a bill. And they don't. Because This is part of our social contract. Social contract. We have a social contract that provides for these services. Public libraries. You can go in to the Albany or Leesburg library and you can borrow a book. As long as you live in the county or the city, you can borrow the book. Military protection. By the way, you pay for the military protection. I pay for military protection. This is part of who we are as a country. We don't have militias. We don't have private funded armies. We have a military. Do you drive on a road, a highway? Do you cross a bridge? Do you go on an interstate, an expressway? All of this is paid for by taxpayer money, i.e. socialism. There are no tolls. Oh, by the way, if you put gas in your car, you're paying a gas tax that helps fund repaving and new roads, highways, bridges, and the interstate. We have public prisons and jails. We have a Veterans Administration. We pay for this. Whether you're a veteran or not, we pay for it. And all veterans, I want to emphasize this, if you are a veteran, you can use the VA. And I emphasize this because all veterans can use the VA. I have an uncle who's 90 years old. He has Medicare. He was a veteran. He uses the VA because he gets his drugs for free at the VA. Farm subsidies. Farm subsidies we pay for those. We pay for those. Pell Grants. So you get a Pell Grant to come to school. We as taxpayers pay for that. So, as a taxpayer, you may be paying for your own Pell Grant. Or I'm paying for it. Or any of us are. But it is offered. Why? An educated populace is a good thing. The FDA, OSHA, USDA, the National Weather Service, the CDC, all of these are paid by taxpayer funding. SNAP, free or reduced lunch, all paid for by taxpayer money. State parks, beaches, all paid for by taxpayer money. If you live up north and you have snow removal, your taxes pay for it. So, living in Ohio, I lived at the corner of two snow routes, which meant that both streets that went by my house were snow routes. And what that meant was the snowplow came by and would remove the snow. Now, that didn't mean that they got my driveway, and if I cleared my driveway and then they came through, it usually dumped it all back in my driveway, so I had to redo it. But I could actually leave my house in my car and drive to work on a snow day. Or I could walk, either way. FEMA is paid for by our tax dollars. So all of these things, this is socialism within the United States. This is exactly what this is. These are social service programs. And we have a lot of socialist programs that people love, by the way. They love it. They don't want you to take away their Social Security or their Medicare. And I probably should have put one of the really interesting slides I saw numerous years ago that said, keep your government paws off my Social Security. And I'm thinking, yeah, okay. But in theory, the wealth of the people, this is part of socialism. In theory, the wealth of the people as a collective organization is used to provide in many socialist countries medical care for all citizens, housing, education, and other services. one of my friends lives in Switzerland and her husband is German, and they had a child, and they pay, Germany paid them to have this child so that they would, pay taxes in Germany. It's really a smart move. So now let's talk about how we have this move from socialist to communist. And so Marx believed that socialism would naturally evolve into a communist society, that the socialist state would wither away and evolve into a communist society. So a lot of people will say, well, the Soviet Union, the China, Vietnam, Cuba, all the nations of Eastern Europe were once thought of as communist economic systems. So one of the things that I think is really important to note is that those nations, although we use this thing as communist, they're not actually what we would call ideal or true communism. Okay, so in an ideal type, in true communism, all property is communally, so here you go, communal ownership of all property. There are no social distinctions made on the basis of a person's ability to produce. Now, what that means is everyone works. There are no social distinctions. So if you're a doctor, there's no social distinction different than if you were an auto mechanic. Now, I always laugh and say, who do we think should be paid the most? Should a garbage collector be paid more than a doctor? I always laugh and when I say, well, everybody goes, no, doctor, because there's so much education, and I'm like, what if the garbage collector does not pick up the trash? What then happens? Well, that becomes a public health crisis. So, then you've got trash that brings mice, and then we've got bubonic plague. So let's really think about, the social distinctions made on the basis of your ability to produce. So what this does is, we're looking at people are paid and they have the ability to have their basic needs met, and there's no social distinction made on the basis of their ability to produce. Now, no longer now are a lot of these communist nations, communist parties, Russia is now capitalist. They, in 2012, had 78 billionaires, which was actually more than New York and London, which was 39. Capitalism has started making inroads. The Ho Chi Minh City Stock Exchange opened in 1990. It trades 600 stocks, representing over 40% now of Vietnam's GDP. And Cuba, when we think about Cuba, from Fidel Castro as being a communist country, well, now Cubans are able to own their own businesses and hire employees. So we're seeing a lot of movement away from communism, and in honestly most countries have a very integrated system of socialism and capitalism. There is no true communist country. So just think about that.